The year the bells of Notre Dame tolled for her arrival was 1295. Isabella, daughter of Philip IV of France, was born into a world woven from silk and shadow, a tapestry of gilded halls and whispered conspiracies. The air in the French court, even in the nursery, was thick with the scent of incense and the subtle, persistent perfume of power. Sunlight, filtered through the vast, arched windows of the royal palace, painted shifting patterns of gold and sapphire across the intricate patterns of the tapestries that adorned the stone walls. These were not mere decorations, they were chronicles of the Capetian dynasty, tales of triumph and, more subtly, of anxieties that clung to the royal bloodline like the damp chill of winter. Isabella, even as a child, possessed an awareness that set her apart. Her eyes, the deep, clear blue of a summer sky, seemed to absorb the intricate dance of diplomacy that unfolded around her. She learned early that her beauty, her intelligence, and her very existence were currency, a vital pawn in the grand game of European alliances. Her tutors spoke of history, of lineage, of the divine right of kings, but beneath the lessons of statecraft lay a more profound education. The understanding that a princess was not a person, but a symbol, a vessel for dynastic ambition. The Capetian curse, a hushed phrase among the courtiers, spoke of the unfortunate fates that often befell the male heirs of her father's line, a shadow that hung over the seemingly unshakable edifice of French power. This awareness, a nascent understanding of the precariousness of their golden world, was instilled in her from the tenderest age. She was a princess, yes, but also a strategic asset, her future already charted on the maps of royal ambition. The year of her formal betrothal was 1307. 12 years old, Isabella stood before the assembled grandeur of the French court, a pale, poised figure beside her father. The man chosen to be her husband was Edward, Prince of England, heir to a kingdom across the churning sea. The negotiations had been a spectacle of royal diplomacy, a delicate balancing act between two powerful crowns, a fragile peace forged in the crucible of strategic necessity. The feasts were a riot of color and sound, the music swelled with a forced gaiety, but Isabella, with her unnervingly perceptive gaze, saw the calculations behind the smiles, the cold, hard realities of treaties and the exchange of a princess for political advantage. She was a jewel to be presented, a pledge of fealty to be secured. Her introduction to her future husband was a brief, almost detached affair. He was young, boisterous, and seemed more interested in the jests of his companions than in the solemnity of the occasion. A flicker of apprehension, a tremor of the unknown, ran through her. She was a girl on the precipice of womanhood, the weight of destiny pressing down on her slender shoulders. Her personal desires, if she dared to acknowledge them, were secondary to the needs of her kingdom. She was to be Queen of England, a role preordained, a destiny she was being carefully prepared to fulfill. The journey to England was a passage across turbulent waters, both literal and metaphorical. The year was 1308. The wedding itself, held in the coastal town of Boulogne, was a magnificent affair, a dazzling display of the wealth and power of two kingdoms. Isabella, adorned in silks and jewels, walked down an aisle that led her from the familiar elegance of the French court to the more boisterous, perhaps less refined, embrace of the English court. Her initial impressions were a bewildering mix of grandeur and foreignness. The English lords, with their rougher manners and their hearty laughter, seemed a stark contrast to the subtle intricacies of Parisian life. Her young groom, now King Edward II after his father's death, was a man of unpredictable moods and a singular, unsettling focus. He possessed a charm, certainly, but it was often overshadowed by an almost childlike capriciousness, a penchant for the company of certain men that raised eyebrows and stirred unease. Isabella navigated these unfamiliar waters with a growing sense of responsibility, a quiet resilience that belied her youth. She was Queen of England now, and the adjustment, she sensed, was only just beginning. The sea voyage had been turbulent, mirroring the storm brewing within her, a storm of apprehension and the dawning, unwelcome realization that her new home might not be the gilded cage she had imagined, but a more challenging, perhaps even dangerous, realm. The years that followed brought the birth of her first child, Prince Edward, a moment of profound significance that should have solidified her position. Yet, the year was 1317, and the king's infatuation had found a new, more dangerous object: Piers Gaveston. Gaveston, a man of Gascon origin, possessed an arrogance that chafed against the ancient nobility of England. His influence over Edward was absolute, his pronouncements treated as royal decrees. The court became a powder keg of resentment, the opulence of royal life overshadowed by a palpable animosity. Whispered gossip turned into open discontent. The barons, accustomed to a voice in the governance of the realm, found themselves systematically ignored, their counsel dismissed in favor of Gaveston's flamboyant pronouncements. Isabella, a young queen witnessing this destructive infatuation, felt a mixture of bewilderment and growing unease. Her own attempts at diplomacy, her gentle efforts to exert influence, were met with Edward's indifference, his gaze fixed solely on his favored companion. She was a mother now, her primary duty to provide an heir, a role she had fulfilled with grace. But as she watched her husband's destructive obsession, she began to understand the precariousness of her own position, and the perilous path that lay ahead for her son. The seeds of rebellion, sown by Gaveston's arrogance and the king's blind devotion, were already taking root in the fertile soil of aristocratic discontent. The court, once a place of calculated alliances and formal decorum, had become a stage for a king's tragic flaw, a spectacle of a realm teetering on the brink of chaos, with Isabella caught in its increasingly suffocating embrace. She found little solace in her royal apartments, the gilded cage now feeling all the more confining as the king's affections, and his attention, were so clearly directed elsewhere. The birth of her son, Prince Edward, in 1317, was a milestone that should have been celebrated with unalloyed joy. It was a testament to her role as queen, the mother of the heir apparent, the future of England secured. But the air in the royal chambers, usually filled with the soft coos of a newborn, was thick with the persistent din of political intrigue. The king, Edward II, remained emotionally distant, his affections, as always, lavished not on his wife or his infant son, but on his ever-present favorites. And now, the shadow of Piers Gaveston had receded, only to be replaced by a new, even more insidious threat, the Despensers. Hugh Despenser the Younger, and his father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, had insinuated themselves into the king's inner circle with a rapacious greed that shocked even the jaded courtiers. Isabella watched their rise with a growing sense of dread. They were not merely favorites, they were architects of a new order, one built on avarice and the systematic dismantling of any opposition. The nursery, with its simple comforts and the innocent slumber of her child, offered a brief, fragile respite from the looming shadows of the court. But even there, the whispers of the Despensers' growing power, their insatiable hunger for land and influence, could not be entirely silenced. Isabella, having fulfilled her most fundamental duty as mother to the heir, found herself increasingly isolated, a queen adrift in a sea of political machinations. A profound disillusionment began to set in, a hardening of her resolve. She understood, with a clarity that chilled her to the bone, that her own future, and that of her children, depended not on the king's affection, but on her own ability to navigate this treacherous landscape. She began to recognize the necessity of external support, a realization that would soon lead her down a path she could scarcely have imagined. The year 1318 was a turning point, a moment when the simmering resentments of the English nobility began to boil over. The Despensers, Hugh the Younger and his aging father, had consolidated their power with a breathtaking audacity. Their rapacious greed was no longer confined to whispered rumors. It was a palpable force, a suffocating weight that pressed down on the entire realm. They had seized lands, extorted fortunes, and systematically undermined any noble who dared to question their ascendancy. Isabella observed their rise with a keen, analytical eye, her initial bewilderment replaced by a cold pragmatism. She saw their destructive ambition, the danger they posed not only to the stability of England but to her own standing and the future of her children. The court, once merely a stage for the king's follies, had become a den of vipers, a toxic blend of fear and avarice where the Despensers reigned supreme. Whispers of discontent grew louder, morphing into outright pronouncements of defiance from a growing number of barons. Yet, Edward II, blinded by his infatuation, remained deaf to their pleas, his loyalty to the Despensers absolute. Isabella, a queen in her own right, felt the sting of their overreach, the insult of their contempt. She was a pawn in their game, her influence diminished, her position increasingly precarious. The atmosphere in the court was heavy with unspoken tension, the opulent halls echoing with the murmur of conspiracy and the palpable fear that the Despensers' insatiable hunger would never be satisfied. In 1321, a pivotal decision was made. Isabella was dispatched to France, ostensibly on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a treaty. But the true purpose, orchestrated by the Despensers, was far more sinister: to remove her from England, to isolate her, and, crucially, to seize her valuable French lands. The journey across the Channel was a voyage into a world that was both familiar and deeply estranged. The French court, under her brother, King Charles IV, offered a fleeting sense of familiar grandeur, the scent of Parisian perfume and the echo of French laughter, a welcome balm after the stifling atmosphere of London. But this comfort was tinged with the melancholy of her mission, the gnawing realization of her husband's betrayal. Charles IV, though a king, possessed a more pliable nature than her own formidable father, and Isabella found in him a more receptive ear, a stark contrast to the deaf ears of Edward II and his grasping favorites. The negotiations were a delicate dance, a performance of royal duty masking the deeper currents of familial estrangement and political maneuvering. She saw the chasm that had opened between her and Edward, a gulf widened by years of neglect, betrayal, and the corrupting influence of the Despensers. The French air, though perfumed with roses and wine, carried the scent of her own isolation, a queen exiled by her own husband, her loyalty questioned, her lands coveted. The refusal to return to England was not a whim, but a calculated decision born of desperation and a dawning sense of agency. The year was 1325. Isabella, having found a sympathetic ear in her brother and a growing network of discontented French nobles, made a choice that would irrevocably alter the course of English history. She sought refuge, not in the gilded halls of power, but in the shadowed exile of Roger Mortimer. Mortimer, an English nobleman, had himself been a victim of Edward II's tyranny, imprisoned and stripped of his lands. In him, Isabella found not only a powerful ally but a man who shared her burning hatred of the Despensers and her desire for retribution. Their alliance solidified rapidly, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of shared grievances, political ambition, and, inevitably, a burgeoning romantic entanglement. The clandestine meetings, held in hushed chambers and shadowed gardens, were charged with a potent blend of desperation and defiance. The air crackled with the thrill of conspiracy, the planning of an invasion that would shake the foundations of England. The Despensers, sensing the growing threat, raged and plotted, their attempts to disinherit Isabella and consolidate their power only serving to further galvanize her resolve. She was no longer merely a queen, she was a woman scorned, a mother wronged, and a leader forged in the fires of betrayal. The years of neglect and humiliation had hardened her, transforming her into a formidable force, ready to reclaim what was hers by right, and to exact a terrible vengeance. The invasion of England in 1326 was swift and decisive. Isabella, clad in armor that mirrored the steel in her soul, landed on the shores of her husband's kingdom, accompanied by Roger Mortimer and their mercenary army, bolstered by a surprising number of disaffected English nobles. The initial reception was not one of resistance, but of open welcome. The years of the Despensers' tyranny had created a deep well of resentment, and Isabella and Mortimer's banners, emblazoned with the promise of a new dawn, were met with widespread support. The flight of Edward II and the Despensers from London was a testament to the swiftness of their success. The atmosphere across the land was electric, a surge of rebellious energy that swept through the towns and villages. The banners of Isabella and Mortimer were raised aloft, symbols of hope for those who had suffered under the king's misguided rule and the Despensers' rapacious grip. Isabella, at the forefront of this burgeoning rebellion, felt a surge of vindication. The years of waiting, of planning, of enduring humiliation, had culminated in this moment. She was no longer a neglected queen, she was a warrior, leading her people against a tyrannical regime, her resolve hardened by experience, her purpose clear: to reclaim her son's birthright and to dismantle the corrupt power structure that had brought England to its knees. The pursuit and capture of the Despensers were brutal and swift. Their reign of terror, so long endured by the English people, ended in the grim necessity of swift justice. The year was 1326, and the English Parliament, influenced by Isabella and Mortimer, declared Edward II deposed. Their son, the young Prince Edward, was proclaimed King Edward III, a boy king under the watchful eyes of his formidable mother and her powerful lover. The mood of the nation shifted from triumphant rebellion to a grim, sober reality. The executions of the Despensers were public spectacles, a stark testament to the depth of animosity they had engendered. Isabella found herself thrust into the heart of a political crisis, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. While the elimination of the Despensers brought a grim satisfaction, the deposition of her husband, the father of her children, weighed heavily on her conscience. She grappled with the moral implications, the irreversible steps she had taken, and the immense responsibility of shaping England's future. The political maneuvering was tense, the monarchy itself hanging precariously in the balance, and Isabella, the queen who had orchestrated this seismic shift, was now at the epicenter of a kingdom in transition, her role as regent a necessary but heavy burden. The future, once a distant dream, was now a tangible and complex reality. The year 1326 dawned with a new order in place. Isabella, no longer merely the queen consort but the queen regent, held the reins of power in England. Her young son, Edward III, was the crowned king, but it was Isabella who governed, her authority formally declared during his minority. A fragile optimism permeated the court. The presence of a queen regent offered a sense of stability after years of turmoil, a promise of a new era where the grievances of the realm might finally be addressed. Isabella, with a mixture of determination and a profound sense of responsibility, began the arduous task of governing. She sought to heal the divisions within the kingdom, to restore order, and to establish her own authority, not just as a mother protecting her son, but as a ruler in her own right. The air was filled with the promise of change, yet the underlying tensions of the recent upheaval remained, a constant reminder of the precariousness of their newfound peace. She felt the weight of the crown, not on her own head, but on the shoulders of her son, and she was resolute in her duty to protect and guide him, to ensure that the kingdom he would one day inherit was stable and just. Yet, as 1327 unfolded, a subtle shift began to occur within the court. Roger Mortimer, the man who had been her liberator and lover, was now the most powerful figure in England, standing shoulder to shoulder with Isabella. His influence over governmental affairs, and increasingly over the young King Edward III, began to foster a quiet resentment among the other nobles. The initial unity that had fueled their rebellion started to fray, replaced by an atmosphere thick with suspicion and veiled accusations. Whispers of an illicit affair between Isabella and Mortimer, once mere gossip, now grew louder, casting a shadow over their joint rule. Isabella found herself increasingly reliant on Mortimer, both for political support and for the emotional solace he provided. She cherished his strength and his unwavering loyalty, but she also began to feel the constraints of his growing power, the subtle ways in which he was shaping not only the kingdom but her own life. The complex emotional landscape she inhabited was a mixture of gratitude for his past actions and a growing unease about the present, a dawning awareness that the balance of power within their relationship was shifting, and that Mortimer's ambition was as boundless as her own had once been. The year 1327 also held a dark secret, a question that hung heavy in the air. What was to become of the deposed king, Edward II? He had been moved from his initial captivity to the remote and imposing Berkeley Castle, a place that soon became synonymous with dread and mystery. His fate remained uncertain, shrouded in secrecy, fueling a growing fear and speculation among the populace. Rumors of his treatment, of the grim end that awaited him, began to circulate like a contagion. The atmosphere around Berkeley Castle was heavy with unspoken fear, the grim anticipation of a king's final moments. Isabella grappled with the immense moral and political implications of Edward II's fate. While the removal of the former king was a political necessity for her and Mortimer's continued power, the act itself was fraught with personal conflict. The dawning realization of the irreversible step she was contemplating, the finality of what had to be done, weighed heavily on her soul. The decision, she knew, was not hers alone, but a shared burden with Mortimer, a pact sealed in the desperate pursuit of power and security. Then, in 1327, the news arrived. Edward II was dead. The official narrative, carefully constructed, cited natural causes, an accident within the confines of Berkeley Castle. But the explanation rang hollow, a thin veneer over the truth. Widespread suspicion, fueled by the whispers that had already begun to circulate, pointed to a deliberate act, a murder orchestrated by Roger Mortimer and sanctioned, or at least tacitly approved, by Isabella. The announcement of his death was met with a chilling silence, a mixture of relief that the uncertainty was over and a profound horror at the means by which it had been resolved. The dark undercurrents of the court, already strong, now pulsed with a palpable sense of conspiracy. Isabella faced a critical juncture. The death of her husband, however it occurred, solidified her position and Mortimer's power, but it also marked a point of no return. She had crossed a threshold, and the moral weight of the event, the irreversible step she had taken, settled upon her, a heavy mantle of consequence. With Edward II gone, Isabella and Mortimer tightened their grip on the reins of government in 1327. The initial hope of a new era of reconciliation and justice began to recede, replaced by an oppressive regime. They ruthlessly suppressed any opposition, consolidating their power with an iron fist. Loyalists to the former king were persecuted, their lands confiscated, their lives threatened. An atmosphere of fear and paranoia descended upon the kingdom. The court, once a stage for political maneuvering, became an arena of suspicion, the shadow of Mortimer's authority looming large over all. Isabella, now firmly entrenched in power, found herself navigating a treacherous path. She experienced a complex interplay of satisfaction at having achieved her goals: the removal of her enemies, the security of her position, and a growing awareness of the moral compromises she had made, the increasing isolation that came with absolute power. The whispers of discontent, though suppressed, continued to murmur beneath the surface, a testament to the growing unpopularity of Mortimer's increasingly brutal rule. The fragile peace established by Isabella and Mortimer began to shatter in 1330. The widespread discontent with Mortimer's rule, his perceived usurpation of royal authority, and the lingering suspicion surrounding Edward II's death, coalesced into open rebellion. Leading the charge was Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward II's own half-brother. Driven by a misguided sense of loyalty and a belief that Edward II had somehow survived his supposed demise, Kent attempted to rally support for the restoration of the former king. It was a desperate, ill-fated gamble. Mortimer, ever ruthless, moved swiftly to crush the rebellion. The execution of the Earl of Kent sent a chilling message throughout the kingdom, a stark demonstration of the brutality of Mortimer's regime and the lengths to which he would go to maintain his power. The atmosphere in England grew heavy with unease, the palpable sense of rebellion a testament to the growing opposition. Isabella witnessed these events with a growing apprehension. She saw the increasing violence of Mortimer's methods, the tide of public disapproval that was beginning to turn against them, and she was forced to confront, perhaps for the first time, the true consequences of their actions and the precariousness of their reign. As 1330 wore on, the young King Edward III, now of age, observed Mortimer's dominance with a growing dissatisfaction that mirrored the simmering resentment of the nobility. He was the king, yet he was a puppet, his authority usurped by his mother's lover and de facto ruler. Edward, intelligent and keenly aware of his royal birthright, began to secretly plot with loyal nobles to overthrow Mortimer and reclaim his throne. A tense undercurrent of defiance simmered beneath the surface of courtly life. The young king navigated a dangerous game of deception, his movements carefully orchestrated to conceal his true intentions from his mother and Mortimer. He felt the humiliation of Mortimer's control, the stifling grip of the man who held his mother captive and his kingdom in his thrall. A deep-seated resentment towards Mortimer grew within him, a desire to free himself and his kingdom from this oppressive influence, and a growing realization that his mother, though once a powerful force, was now seemingly bound to Mortimer's will. The dramatic confrontation came in 1330. Edward III, with the unwavering support of key nobles who had long chafed under Mortimer's rule, orchestrated a daring raid on Nottingham Castle. The element of surprise was absolute. Mortimer and his closest allies were apprehended in their beds, their reign of terror brought to an abrupt and violent end. Isabella was present, a silent witness to her son's decisive action. She offered no resistance, no plea for Mortimer's life. The air crackled with tension, the swift and brutal assertion of the young king's authority marking the end of Mortimer's dominance. For Isabella, it was a moment of complex emotion, relief that Mortimer's oppressive influence was finally over, but also a profound dread, a premonition of the reckoning that was to come, the potential end of her own power and the beginning of her fall from grace. The year 1331 saw the finality of Mortimer's downfall. He was swiftly tried for treason, his crimes laid bare before the court. His execution was a public spectacle, a grim end to a man who had wielded immense power. Simultaneously, Isabella's regency was formally ended. Stripped of her power, she was sent to live in comfortable confinement, her days of influence and authority over. Her surroundings were luxurious, but the gilded cage was now a prison, her isolation absolute. The opulent chambers could not mask the profound silence that had descended upon her life, a stark contrast to the power and influence she had once wielded. The years of confinement offered a stark, and perhaps unwelcome, opportunity for reflection. She was a woman who had risen to unprecedented heights, who had dared to defy convention, and who had ultimately fallen from grace. The weight of her actions, the moral compromises she had made, the love and ambition that had driven her, all converged in the quiet solitude of her later years. Isabella lived out her remaining years in this state of enforced quietude, her fate sealed by the choices she had made. Her eventual death, though unmarked by the fanfare of her rise, marked the end of a tumultuous era. Her legacy, however, endured, a subject of enduring fascination and controversy. She was the she-wolf of France, a queen who had played a dangerous game of power, who had allied herself with a lover to depose her husband and seize control of a kingdom. Her story was a complex tapestry woven from threads of ambition, love, betrayal, and ultimately, downfall. In her final years, Isabella was a figure of reflection, a woman whose life served as a cautionary tale of the perilous nature of power, the intoxicating allure of ambition, and the enduring complexities of the human heart. Her indelible mark on English history was a testament to a queen who dared to seize control, and in doing so, forever altered the course of a nation. The gilded cage of France had always held a certain allure, even for a princess destined for a foreign throne. Isabella, daughter of Philip IV, had been schooled in its intricate dances of power and diplomacy, her beauty a weapon, her lineage a currency. Yet, the grandeur of the Capetian court, with its whispered anxieties and the chilling legacy of a curse that seemed to plague its male heirs, had also taught her the precariousness of royal blood. She was a pawn, yes, but a pawn of exceptional intelligence, her education a meticulous tapestry woven with the threads of languages, histories, and the subtle art of observation. The year 1307, a mere 12 years into her life, saw that tapestry irrevocably altered. The betrothal to Edward, Prince of England, was announced, a grand spectacle of royal diplomacy designed to forge a fragile peace between two powerful kingdoms. The feasts were lavish, the music grand, but behind the glittering smiles and the clinking of goblets lay the cold, hard realities of treaties and the calculated exchange of a princess for political gain. Isabella, on the cusp of womanhood, felt the immense pressure of her new role, a mixture of apprehension and a dawning sense of destiny, tinged with the stark awareness that her personal desires were secondary to the needs of her kingdom. The journey to England was a bewildering mix of grandeur and foreignness. The sea voyage was turbulent, mirroring her internal state as she sailed towards an unknown future. Boulogne, the site of her wedding, shimmered with a forced gaiety, but the English court, when she finally arrived, felt different. Less refined, perhaps more boisterous, than the Parisian salons she knew. Her young groom, Edward, was a boy of outward charm, but even then, a disquieting impression began to form. This was not the polished court of France. It was a realm of different customs, different temperaments, and a king whose affections seemed easily swayed. The years that followed were a stark education for the young queen. Edward, now King Edward II, revealed a personality that baffled and dismayed her. His infatuation with Piers Gaveston, a man whose arrogance seemed to know no bounds, created a palpable rift within the English nobility. Isabella, still so young, found herself in an unenviable position. She was the queen, yet her husband's blatant disregard for tradition, his open favoritism towards his male companion, overshadowed her own standing. The court became a powder keg of resentment and whispered gossip. The opulence of their surroundings was a thin veneer over a deep-seated animosity, a constant hum of discontent that Isabella could not ignore. She observed this destructive infatuation with a mixture of bewilderment and growing unease. She was a queen, but a queen witnessing her husband's self-inflicted wounds, the seeds of rebellion being sown by his own hand. Her initial attempts at diplomacy, at subtly guiding the king, were met with his characteristic indifference, his gaze fixed not on his queen, but on the man who held his complete, uncritical devotion. Then, a flicker of hope, a moment of domestic triumph, the birth of her first child, Prince Edward, the heir to the throne. This event, which should have solidified her position, brought a sense of purpose and a tangible link to England's future. Yet, even this milestone was clouded. The king's affections, once fixated on Gaveston, now seemed to drift towards new figures, men who, like the Despensers, harbored ambitions that Isabella could already sense. The nursery offered a brief, fragile respite, a sanctuary of soft linen and the innocent coos of her infant son, but the shadows of the court, with its persistent political intrigue and the king's emotional distance, loomed large. A profound sense of isolation began to settle upon her. She had fulfilled her primary duty as mother to the heir, yet she found herself increasingly adrift, a pawn still, but a pawn in a game whose rules were becoming more dangerous, more capricious. A quiet resilience, however, began to harden within her. She understood, with a chilling clarity, the necessity of securing her own future, and that of her children, in a kingdom where the king's affections were a fickle wind, and the ambitions of his favorites a gathering storm. The storm broke, not with a sudden tempest, but with the insidious creep of a suffocating influence. Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father, like a pair of grasping vines, began to twine themselves around the king, their avarice and arrogance eclipsing even Gaveston's earlier excesses. Isabella watched their rise with a keen, analytical eye. She saw not just their rapacious greed, but the destructive ambition that threatened to poison every aspect of governance, every facet of courtly life. The whispers of discontent among the barons grew louder. Their initial attempts to curb the dispenser's influence met with the king's unwavering, and increasingly dangerous, loyalty to his new favorites. The court became a suffocating weight, a place where fear and avarice danced a macabre jig. The dispenser's presence was a constant, palpable threat, their power a suffocating blanket that stifled dissent and fueled resentment. Isabella, a queen in her own right, felt the danger keenly. She saw the peril they posed not only to the realm, but to her own standing, to the future of her son, the young prince. A cold, calculating pragmatism began to shape her thoughts, a quiet resolve to protect what was hers, what was England's. It was in this charged atmosphere that Edward, perhaps at the instigation of the dispensers who sought to remove a potential obstacle from their path, dispatched Isabella to France. Her mission was ostensibly to negotiate a treaty, a diplomatic endeavor that would keep her occupied and far from the machinations of the English court. But Isabella, no longer the naive girl who had arrived in England years before, understood the true purpose. She was to be isolated, her French lands, her rightful inheritance, vulnerable to seizure. In Paris, the court of her brother, King Charles IV, offered a fleeting sense of familiar grandeur, a welcome respite from the oppressive atmosphere of London. Yet, even here, the melancholy of her mission and the growing realization of her husband's betrayal cast a long shadow. The negotiations were a delicate dance, a performance of diplomacy that masked the deeper currents of familial estrangement and political expediency. Charles, though a king, was also her brother, and in his eyes, she saw not the cold calculations of Edward, but a flicker of sympathy, a more receptive ear. The chasm between her and Edward, once a source of quiet sorrow, now yawned wide, an unbridgeable gulf of mistrust and manipulation. The French court, however, offered more than just a temporary sanctuary. It was here, amidst the veiled intrigues and the lingering scent of French perfume, that Isabella's resolve truly solidified. The dispenser's machinations to secure her lands, Edward's blatant disregard for her person and her rights, coalesced into a potent, unshakable decision. She would not return to England. Instead, she sought refuge with a man who understood exile, a man who harbored his own grievances against the dispensers and the king, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer, the Earl of March, a nobleman imprisoned and dispossessed, became her confidant, her ally, and, as the clandestine meetings continued, something more. Their alliance was forged in the crucible of shared hatred and mutual ambition. The air in their hidden chambers crackled with a dangerous blend of desperation, political calculation, and a burgeoning romantic entanglement. They spoke of invasion, of reclaiming England from the grip of the dispensers, of a future where their power would be absolute. The dispensers, enraged by Isabella's defiance and Mortimer's burgeoning influence, redoubled their efforts to disinherit her, to strip her of every last vestige of power. But they underestimated the queen. The years of neglect and betrayal had not broken her. They had forged her into something harder, something more resolute. She embraced the role of active participant in her own destiny, driven by a potent mix of righteous anger and a burning desire for retribution. The meticulously planned invasion was a swift, decisive strike. Isabella, clad in armor, stood beside Mortimer as their mercenary army, bolstered by the support of disaffected English nobles who had long chafed under the dispenser's tyranny, landed on English soil. The initial reception was a revelation. The banners of Isabella and Mortimer were raised, not just as symbols of rebellion, but as harbingers of a potential new dawn. Hope, long suppressed, surged through the ranks of those who had suffered under the dispenser's iron fist. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation, the thrill of rebellion electrifying the air. London erupted in support, and the king and his hated favorites, caught completely off guard, were forced to flee, their reign of terror crumbling around them. The speed of their success was breathtaking. The dispensers, once seemingly invincible, were now fugitives, their arrogance replaced by a desperate scramble for survival. The pursuit was relentless. The dispensers, father and son, were captured, their arrogance shattered, their power extinguished. Their executions were brutal and swift, a stark testament to the depth of animosity they had inspired. The realm rejoiced at their demise, but the victory was tinged with a grim necessity. The English Parliament, influenced by the formidable partnership of Isabella and Mortimer, declared Edward II deposed. It was a momentous decision, a seismic shift in the very foundations of the monarchy. The elimination of the dispensers brought a grim satisfaction, but the deposition of her husband, the man she had once married, weighed heavily. She grappled with the moral implications of the events, the immense responsibility of shaping England's future now resting squarely upon her shoulders. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril, but she had taken it, and there was no turning back. The air in England, after the dust of rebellion settled, was thick with a fragile optimism. Isabella, no longer merely the queen consort, but the queen regent, held the reins of power during her young son's minority. The title itself was a testament to her remarkable journey, a queen who had arrived as a pawn and now commanded armies, deposed kings, and held the fate of a nation in her hands. She began the arduous task of governing, her efforts focused on healing the deep divisions within the kingdom, on establishing her authority not just as a mother, but as a ruler. The opulence of the court, once a source of bewilderment, now felt like a stage upon which she had to perform, to project an image of strength and stability. Yet, beneath the veneer of order, the undercurrents of the recent upheaval remained, a constant reminder of the precariousness of her position. She embraced her new role with a mixture of fierce determination and a profound sense of responsibility. The weight of the crown, she felt, was not on her own head, but on the young shoulders of her son, and she was resolute in her duty to protect and guide him, to ensure that the future she had fought so hard to secure would not crumble. But power, once tasted, is a potent intoxicant, and Roger Mortimer, the man who had stood beside her in exile, now stood beside her at the pinnacle of English authority. His consolidation of power was swift and undeniable. He was the most influential figure in England, his counsel sought, his will often paramount, even over that of the young King Edward III. A subtle shift began to occur within the court. The initial unity, forged in the fires of rebellion, began to fray. Mortimer's dominance, once a welcome strength, now felt like a constraint. Whispers, once confined to the shadowed corners of taverns, now echoed in the grand halls of Westminster. The atmosphere was thick with suspicion, with veiled accusations, and the murmurs of an illicit affair between the Queen Regent and her powerful consort grew louder, more insistent. Isabella found herself increasingly reliant on Mortimer, not just for political strategy, but for emotional support. The years of neglect by Edward II had left their mark, and Mortimer's unwavering attention, his fervent declarations of loyalty and affection, were a balm to her wounded spirit. Yet, even as she cherished his support, she began to feel the constraints of his growing power, the suffocating embrace of his ambition, and the corrosive whispers that surrounded their relationship. Her emotional landscape became a complex tapestry of gratitude, burgeoning love, and a gnawing unease. Meanwhile, the deposed king, Edward II, remained a ghost in the machinations of the new regime. Moved from one castle to another, he was eventually transferred to Berkeley Castle, a remote, formidable fortress on the Welsh border. His fate, from that moment on, became increasingly uncertain, shrouded in a chilling veil of secrecy. Rumors and speculation about his treatment, his suffering, and his eventual demise began to circulate like a dark miasma through the kingdom. The air in Berkeley Castle was heavy with unspoken fear, the grim anticipation of a king's final moments. Isabella, though removed from the immediate details, was acutely aware of the political necessity of Edward's permanent removal. Mortimer, ever the pragmatist, understood that as long as Edward lived, he represented a potential rallying point for disaffected loyalists, a threat to their hard-won power. The machinations, subtle yet undeniably present, were orchestrated by Mortimer, and Isabella, though perhaps wrestling with profound personal conflict, gave her tacit, and ultimately necessary, acquiescence. The act itself, however it was carried out, marked a point of no return, a profound moral weight that settled upon her, the dawning realization of the irreversible step she had taken. Then, the announcement came, delivered with the carefully chosen words of officialdom. Edward II had died at Berkeley Castle. The official narrative cited natural causes, a tragic accident, a king succumbing to illness. But the explanation rang hollow, a flimsy excuse against the tide of suspicion that had been building for months. The widespread belief, whispered in hushed tones across the land, was that his death was a deliberate act, orchestrated by Roger Mortimer, and sanctioned, if not directly commanded, by Isabella herself. The news of his death was met not with an outpouring of grief, but with a chilling silence, a mixture of relief that the political uncertainty was over and horror at the grim reality of how it had been achieved. The dark undercurrents of the court, the pervasive sense of conspiracy, now solidified into a chilling certainty. Isabella stood at a critical juncture. The death of her husband, however it had occurred, had solidified her position and Mortimer's power, but it had also irrevocably sealed their fate, marking a point of no return. She had to reconcile the political necessity of their actions with the profound moral weight of the event, a weight that would undoubtedly shape the remainder of her life. With Edward II's death, Isabella and Mortimer's grip on the reins of government tightened, becoming absolute. The fragile optimism that had initially permeated the court began to dissipate, replaced by an oppressive regime. Any opposition, any whisper of dissent, was ruthlessly suppressed. Loyalists to the former king, men who had served Edward faithfully, were persecuted, their lands confiscated, their lives forfeit. An atmosphere of fear and resentment settled over the kingdom. Mortimer's authority, now unchecked, loomed large over all, his shadow a constant reminder of the ruthless efficiency with which he maintained his power. Isabella, now firmly entrenched in her role as regent, found herself navigating a treacherous path. There was a complex interplay of satisfaction at having achieved her goals, at having overthrown the tyranny of the dispensers and secured her own power. But there was also a growing awareness of the moral compromises she had made, the blood that had been spilled, and the increasing isolation that came with wielding absolute power. The initial hope of a new era had given way to the grim reality of an oppressive rule, a rule she had helped to forge. The foundations of Isabella and Mortimer's power, however, were not as unshakable as they believed. Discontent, long suppressed, began to boil over. The perceived usurpation of royal authority by Mortimer, his increasingly arrogant displays of power, and Isabella's complicity in his harsh measures fueled a rising tide of opposition. This simmering unrest culminated in a desperate, ill-fated rebellion led by Edmund, the Earl of Kent, Edward II's own half-brother. Kent, driven by a misguided loyalty or perhaps a genuine belief that Edward II had survived his imprisonment, attempted to place a supposed surviving Edward on the throne. It was a foolhardy endeavor, a last gasp of defiance against Mortimer's iron grip. Mortimer, ever ruthless, crushed the rebellion with brutal efficiency, and the Earl of Kent was swiftly executed. The chilling message sent throughout the kingdom was clear: any challenge to their authority would be met with swift and decisive force. Isabella watched the events surrounding Kent's rebellion with growing apprehension. She saw the increasing brutality of Mortimer's methods, the palpable fear he instilled, and the rising tide of public disapproval. The consequences of their actions, once abstract political necessities, were now becoming starkly, terrifyingly real. Meanwhile, the young king, Edward III, was no longer a child. Now of age, he observed Mortimer's dominance with growing dissatisfaction, his humiliation palpable. He was the rightful king, yet he was a figurehead, his authority usurped by his mother's lover and his kingdom governed by his mother's will, a will increasingly dictated by Mortimer. A dangerous game of deception began. Edward, carefully orchestrating his movements, began to secretly plot with loyal nobles, men who, like him, chafed under Mortimer's control. The atmosphere within the court became one of simmering defiance, a tense undercurrent of rebellion hidden beneath the veneer of courtly life. Edward felt the weight of his royal birthright, the humiliation of Mortimer's suffocating presence, and a deep-seated resentment towards the man who controlled his mother and his kingdom. His sense of duty to England, to his people, burned brightly, eclipsing any filial affection he might have once held for Isabella. The culmination of Edward's clandestine plotting arrived with dramatic swiftness. With the support of key nobles, he orchestrated a daring raid on Nottingham Castle, the very heart of Mortimer's power. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Mortimer and his closest allies were apprehended, their reign of terror brought to an abrupt, brutal end. Isabella was present, a silent witness to her son's assertion of authority. She offered no resistance, perhaps a dawning realization of the inevitable, perhaps a profound sense of relief that Mortimer's oppressive influence was finally being broken. The air crackled with the sudden, decisive shift in power, the dramatic arrest at Nottingham Castle a stark assertion of the young king's rightful authority. For Isabella, it was a moment of complex emotions. Relief that Mortimer's suffocating grip was loosening, but also dread, a premonition of her own reckoning. The aftermath was swift and unforgiving. Roger Mortimer was tried for treason, his crimes laid bare before the court. His execution was a public spectacle, a grim finality that underscored the end of his reign. Isabella's fate, though less brutal, was no less definitive. She was stripped of her regency, her power summarily revoked. She was sent to live in relative comfort, her quarters luxurious, but her confinement was effective, a gilded cage from which she was effectively exiled from public life. The opulent surroundings could not mask the profound silence, the stark contrast to the power and influence she had once wielded. Her isolation was complete. In the quiet solitude of her confinement, she was left to confront the consequences of her actions, to grapple with the profound moral weight of her choices. The years of ambition, the intoxicating taste of power, the dangerous alliance with Mortimer, all culminated in this solitary existence. She experienced a profound sense of loss, of regret, and perhaps, a dawning, painful awareness of the true cost of her ambition, the devastating price of her love. Her eventual death, years later, marked the end of a truly extraordinary and tumultuous era. Her legacy, however, remained a subject of intense debate, a complex tapestry woven with threads of power, ambition, ruthlessness, and ultimately, downfall. She was the She-Wolf of France, a title that spoke to her ferocity, her cunning, and her role in the bloody overthrow of her husband. She was a queen who had dared to defy convention, to seize control in a world dominated by men, and in doing so, had left an indelible, unforgettable mark on English history. Her story, a cautionary tale of ambition, love, and the perilous, often destructive, nature of power, continued to fascinate and to haunt, a testament to the enduring enigma of a queen who rose higher than any woman before her, only to fall, irrevocably, from grace. The air in Westminster Palace, once thick with the scent of beeswax and the murmur of counsel, now hung heavy with the cloying perfume of power and the sharp tang of fear. Isabella, no longer the bewildered bride or the neglected queen, stood at the apex of a fragile pyramid, her young son, Edward, a golden figurehead beside her. She was regent, the shield and sword of England, her word law while her son's hands were still too small to grasp the scepter. The ink on the formal declarations was barely dry, yet already the weight of the crown, though not upon her own head, pressed down with crushing insistence. She moved through the echoing halls, her silks rustling like dry leaves, her gaze sharp, assessing, cataloging the faces that bowed before her. There was a desperate optimism in the air, a fragile hope that the bloody storm had passed, leaving a clear sky. But Isabella, who had learned the brutal calculus of survival in a world that prized beauty and breeding above all else, knew that clear skies could be deceptive, and that the deepest shadows often hid the most dangerous beasts. She set about the arduous task of governance, her days a relentless tide of petitions, decrees, and the constant, gnawing need to mend the gaping wounds torn in the fabric of the kingdom. She sought to restore order, to soothe the raw nerves of a populace weary of conflict, to establish her authority not just as a placeholder for her son, but as a force in her own right. Yet, beneath the veneer of regal composure, a disquieting undercurrent began to stir. Roger Mortimer, the name itself had become a whispered incantation in the gilded cages of the nobility. He was the falcon at her side, the iron fist that had helped clear the path to this precarious summit. His presence was a constant, a palpable force that filled the chambers where once only the king's favorites had dared to tread. He was the strategist, the warrior, the man who had shared her exile and her feverish dreams of retribution. Now, he was the most powerful man in England, second only to the boy king, and inextricably linked to Isabella. His influence seeped into every facet of governance, his counsel sought, his opinions deferred to. The young Edward, his eyes too wide for his years, watched his mother and Mortimer with a mixture of awe and a dawning, unsettling awareness. The whispers began, insidious and venomous, slithering through the corridors like vipers. They spoke of more than just political alliance, of a bond forged in shared hardship and ambition, a bond that blurred the lines between queen and consort, between regent and lover. The nobles, their own ambitions curtailed, their resentments simmering, watched with narrowed eyes, the once clear unity of their rebellion beginning to fray. The air, once charged with the thrill of defiance, now grew thick with suspicion and veiled accusations. Isabella found herself increasingly reliant on Mortimer, on his strength, his decisiveness, his unwavering belief in their shared destiny. He was the anchor in the tempest, the confidant who understood the burden she carried. But even as she cherished his support, a subtle unease began to creep in. The whispers, though directed at their relationship, hinted at a deeper truth. Mortimer's grip was tightening, not just on her, but on the young king, on the very reins of power. She felt the constraints of his dominance, a subtle but persistent pressure that began to chafe against her own burgeoning sense of authority. Then came the matter of Edward II. The deposed king, the husband who had once been her tormentor, her neglectful lord, was now a liability, a ghost that haunted their meticulously constructed present. He was moved, a pawn in a deadly game, from one distant castle to another, his final destination a grim, brooding fortress perched on a lonely escarpment, Berkeley Castle. The very name conjured images of damp stone, echoing dungeons, and the chilling embrace of oblivion. He was a prisoner now, his fate sealed not by a formal sentence, but by the silent, unspoken understanding that passed between Isabella and Mortimer. The air around Berkeley grew heavy with a palpable sense of foreboding, a chilling atmosphere of dread and mystery. He was to be kept from the world, his existence a carefully guarded secret. Yet, secrets, especially those involving the fate of kings, have a way of seeping into the light. Rumors, like tendrils of fog, began to curl around the edges of the court, whispers of his treatment, his suffering, his eventual, inevitable demise. Isabella, caught in the vortex of her newfound power, found herself grappling with the immense moral and political implications of Edward's fate. He was the father of her son, the king she had once sworn to obey. Yet, he was also the man whose weakness and infatuation had plunged England into chaos, the man whose continued existence threatened the fragile peace they had so bloodily forged. The removal of the former king was a political necessity, a brutal but undeniable truth that gnawed at her conscience. She saw the machinations unfolding, the subtle pressure exerted by Mortimer, the careful orchestration of events that would ensure Edward's permanent removal from the board. It was a step she had not fully anticipated, a precipice she had not fully acknowledged until it loomed before her, stark and terrifying. The news arrived not with a fanfare of trumpets, but with a hushed pronouncement, a carefully worded statement delivered by a grim-faced messenger. At Berkeley Castle, the official narrative was a tapestry woven with threads of natural causes, of a tragic accident, of a king consumed by his own despair. But the explanation, like a poorly tailored garment, fit poorly, its seams strained and obvious. The court, the kingdom, indeed, the very air of England, seemed to hold its breath. A chilling silence descended, a mixture of grim satisfaction and a profound, unsettling horror. The official explanation rang hollow, a thin veneer over the dark, undeniable undercurrent of conspiracy. Everyone knew, with a certainty that defied proof, that this was no accident. It was a deliberate act, a calculated move orchestrated by Roger Mortimer, the man who now held Isabella's heart and her kingdom in his grasp, and sanctioned, if not directly commanded, by Isabella herself. She stood at a critical juncture, the death of her husband, however it had transpired, a point of no return. It solidified her position, and Mortimer's, cementing their power in a way that no abdication decree ever could. But it also marked a profound moral reckoning. The weight of the act settled upon her, a heavy shroud that no amount of regal finery could conceal. She had crossed a threshold, and the path back was irrevocably lost. With Edward II's death, Isabella and Mortimer's grip on England tightened with ruthless efficiency. The brief period of hopeful transition had dissolved into an atmosphere of oppressive control. Opposition was not tolerated, it was crushed. Perceived threats, particularly those loyal to the memory of the deposed king, were systematically eliminated. The whispers of discontent, once confined to hushed conversations in shadowed alcoves, grew louder, morphing into open murmurs of defiance. The initial euphoria of their triumph had curdled into an era of fear. The court, once a stage for political maneuvering, now felt like an arena where paranoia reigned supreme. Mortimer's authority, now unchecked and absolute, loomed like a specter over all. Isabella, ensconced in the trappings of her regency, found herself navigating a treacherous landscape. There was a grim satisfaction, a cold vindication in having achieved their ultimate goals. The obstacles had been removed, the enemies vanquished. But this satisfaction was increasingly overshadowed by a growing awareness of the moral compromises she had made, the bloody path they had trod. The isolation, once a source of strength and resolve, now began to feel like a prison. The opulence of her surroundings could not mask the gnawing emptiness, the profound sense of having traded one form of captivity for another, albeit one of her own making. The reign of terror, a dark bloom sprung from the soil of ambition and necessity, had taken root. The fragile peace that Isabella and Mortimer had so carefully cultivated began to fracture. The discontent, long simmering beneath the surface, erupted into open rebellion. At the heart of this dissent was Edmund, Earl of Kent, Edward II's own half-brother. Driven by a desperate, misplaced loyalty, or perhaps a shrewd calculation that the time was ripe for a shift in power, he sought to restore Edward II, clinging to the notion that the king had not truly died, but had been spirited away. His rebellion, though brave in its conviction, was ill-fated and tragically misguided. Mortimer, ever vigilant, ever ruthless, saw it as a direct challenge to his authority, a dangerous spark that threatened to ignite the entire kingdom. The rebellion was swiftly and brutally crushed. The Earl of Kent, a man of royal blood, was apprehended and, with chilling finality, executed for treason. His downfall sent a seismic shockwave through the realm, a grim testament to Mortimer's absolute control and his unwavering resolve to eliminate any who dared to question his dominion. The execution was not just the end of a rebellion, it was a stark, terrifying message delivered to every corner of England. Resistance would be met with swift and brutal retribution. The air, once thick with the promise of a new dawn under Isabella's regency, was now heavy with the suffocating weight of fear and the palpable sense of an oppressive regime. Young Edward, the King of England in name, was no longer a child oblivious to the machinations of his court. He had come of age, his eyes now open to the suffocating reality of Mortimer's dominance. He saw the man who had usurped his father, who now seemed to hold his mother captive, not in chains, but in the silken bonds of affection and shared power. He watched, with a growing sense of humiliation and a deep-seated resentment, as Mortimer controlled the reins of government, as his mother, the Queen Regent, seemed content to play a secondary role. The king who had once been a pawn in his father's games was now a young man, keenly aware of his own royal birthright and the indignity of his current position. He began to plot, a dangerous game of deception played out in the very heart of the court. He moved with careful deliberation, his actions meticulously orchestrated to conceal his true intentions from both his mother and Mortimer. He found allies among the nobles who chafed under Mortimer's tyranny, men who yearned for a return to a more traditional form of royal authority. A tense undercurrent of defiance simmered beneath the polished surface of courtly life, a silent rebellion brewing in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. The moment arrived with the chilling efficiency of a well-executed ambush. Under the cloak of darkness, Edward, with the unwavering support of a select group of loyal nobles, launched a daring raid on Nottingham Castle, Mortimer's stronghold. The air crackled with an almost unbearable tension as the king's men stormed the stronghold, their purpose unmistakable. Mortimer, caught off guard, found himself surrounded, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Isabella was present, a silent, almost spectral figure amidst the chaos. She offered no resistance, no plea, no defense of the man who had shared her power, her bed, her ambition. Perhaps it was the dawning realization of her son's rightful claim, or perhaps it was the sheer terror of Mortimer's downfall, but her acquiescence was absolute. The dramatic arrest was a swift, brutal assertion of the young king's authority, a thunderclap that shattered the oppressive silence of Mortimer's reign of terror. The falcon had been captured, his wings clipped, his dominance irrevocably broken. Isabella, standing in the aftermath, felt a complex swirl of emotions. Relief that Mortimer's oppressive influence was finally broken, but also a profound dread of the reckoning that was surely to come. Her own power, so carefully cultivated, so fiercely defended, now felt as fragile as spun glass. The swiftness of Mortimer's fall was matched only by the ruthlessness of his end. He was tried for treason, the charges a litany of his transgressions, his arrogance, his ambition, his perceived usurpation of royal authority. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, the man who had dared to dream of ruling England through his queen and her son, was condemned and swiftly executed. His death marked the official end of his reign of terror, but it also signaled the end of Isabella's own reign. Stripped of her regency, her power dissolved like mist in the morning sun, she was removed from the center of political life. Not to a dungeon, not to the squalor of poverty, but to a life of luxurious confinement. She was sent to various castles, well-appointed residences where her comfort was assured, but her freedom was extinguished. Her days were now marked by a profound silence, a stark and chilling contrast to the clamor of power she had once commanded. The opulence of her surroundings could not fill the void left by her lost influence, nor could it mask her profound isolation. The queen who had dared to defy convention, who had dared to seize power, was now a prisoner of her own making, condemned to a life of quiet reflection, a life where the ghosts of her past were her only companions. Isabella lived out her remaining years in this gilded cage, her fate sealed by the ambitious choices she had made, by the bloody path she had trod. The she-wolf of France, as she had come to be known, a title whispered with a mixture of fear and awe, was now a shadow of her former self. Her eventual release from confinement, a gesture of reconciliation by her son, brought little solace. The years of isolation had taken their toll, leaving her a figure of melancholy, a queen who had scaled the heights of power only to be cast down by the very forces she had unleashed. Her death, when it finally came, marked the quiet end of a tumultuous era, a period of unprecedented female power and ruthless ambition. Her legacy, however, was far from quiet. It was, and remains, a subject of enduring fascination and fierce debate. Was she a victim of circumstance, a woman pushed to the brink by a weak and neglectful husband, forced to forge her own destiny in a man's world? Or was she a power-hungry schemer, a treacherous wife and mother who orchestrated the downfall and likely murder of her king for personal gain? Her story, a complex tapestry woven with threads of love, betrayal, ambition, and regicide, serves as a potent and cautionary tale. It is a testament to the enduring power of a queen who dared to defy convention, who dared to seize control, and who ultimately paid the ultimate price for her ambition, her love, and her perilous dance with power. The air in England, once thick with the scent of rebellion and the heady perfume of newfound power, began to carry a different aroma, the cloying sweetness of fear. The swift, brutal justice meted out to Roger Mortimer at the hands of his accusers, led by a king now fully aware of the extent of his mother's complicity, had sent a tremor through the court. Mortimer, the architect of so much of the recent upheaval, the man who had shared Isabella's bed and her ambition, swung from the common gallows, a stark testament to the shifting sands of power. His execution, a public spectacle designed to solidify Edward III's authority, left a chilling void. Isabella watched from a distance, no longer the formidable regent, but a queen stripped bare of her authority. Her regency, once a symbol of her triumphant return and ascendancy, was now a memory, a fading tapestry of power. The young king, her son, the boy she had fought to protect and elevate, had decisively severed the silken threads that bound them. She was no longer his guiding hand, but a gilded bird in a cage. Her confinement was not the dank cell of a common prisoner, but a gilded prison, a testament to her former status and the lingering, though diminished, affection of her son. The stones of her residence, though finely wrought and adorned with tapestries depicting happier times, felt cold, unyielding. The scent of lavender and beeswax, once a comfort, now seemed to mock her with its suggestion of domesticity, a life she had forfeited. The whispers that had once swirled around her, tales of seduction and ruthless ambition, now coalesced into a single, damning narrative. The she-wolf of France, who had devoured her king and her own reputation. The young Edward, now truly king, moved with a newfound authority, his gaze sharp, his decisions swift. He had learned at the knees of his mother and her lover, absorbing lessons in power, manipulation, and the necessity of decisive action. The failed rebellion of Edmund, Earl of Kent, who had so foolishly attempted to stir sentiment for a supposedly living Edward II, had served as a brutal catalyst. Mortimer's ruthless suppression of Kent, his execution for treason, had exposed the precariousness of their rule and the depth of the opposition that still simmered beneath the surface. Isabella had witnessed it all, a silent observer to the unraveling of the world she had so carefully constructed. The pleas of Kent, her own half-brother, had fallen on deaf-eared ears, or perhaps, more accurately, on ears attuned to a different melody of survival. She had felt a flicker of her former self, a pang of regret, but it was quickly subsumed by the overwhelming need for self-preservation, a lesson etched deep into her soul by years of neglect and betrayal. Her isolation was profound. The ladies-in-waiting who attended her moved with a hushed deference, their eyes averted, their smiles polite but distant. They were her keepers, not her confidants. The opulent chambers, once the scene of lavish feasts and whispered political stratagems, now echoed with the silence of her solitude. She would trace the patterns on the tapestries with a trembling finger, her mind replaying the scenes of her life, the glittering courts of France, the youthful promise of her marriage, the gnawing resentment of Edward's infatuation with his favorites, the dawning realization of her own strength, and the intoxicating, dangerous allure of Mortimer. The scent of wood smoke from distant hearths would drift in on the wind, a poignant reminder of the world beyond her walls, a world she had once commanded. She had seen her son grow from a boy into a man, his face hardening, his eyes reflecting the weight of the crown he now bore. She had watched him learn to trust, to discern, and ultimately, to act. The raid on Nottingham Castle, a scene she had observed from the periphery, was a masterclass in decisive leadership. The clatter of armor, the shouts of guards, the swift apprehension of Mortimer, it had all unfolded with a brutal efficiency that both awed and terrified her. She had offered no protest, no plea for the man who had been her lover, her partner in power. The moment had passed, the tide had turned, and she had recognized it. Her acquiescence was not born of coldness, but of a profound understanding that her time had passed, that her son's claim to the throne was paramount, and that Mortimer's reign, however intertwined with her own, had ultimately been a doomed enterprise. The years that followed were a slow descent into a quiet oblivion. Her initial confinement, though comfortable, was a constant reminder of her fallen status. She received news of her son's reign, of his victories on the continent, of the growing prosperity of England. She was a queen dowager, an honored but distant figure, her past a subject of hushed speculation and historical debate. Some called her the she-wolf, a dangerous temptress who had led her king to ruin. Others saw her as a victim, a beautiful pawn in a brutal game of power, forced to take drastic measures for survival. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere in the shadowed middle ground. She had been a woman of immense intelligence and beauty, thrust into a world of brutal politics. She had endured neglect and humiliation, and in her fight for survival and the protection of her children, she had made choices that irrevocably shaped her destiny and the destiny of England. There were moments, in the long, quiet afternoons, when her son would visit. These were not visits of warmth and affection, but of duty, of obligation. He would sit with her, his gaze polite but distant, speaking of matters of state, of his own children. She would listen, her mind a vast repository of memories, her heart a landscape of regret and faded ambition. She saw in his eyes the reflection of her own ambition, the same drive for power that had once consumed her. But in him, it was tempered by a sense of justice, a desire to rule with honor, a lesson perhaps learned from the harsh consequences of her own reign. Her eventual release from confinement, years later, was not a grand return to power, but a quiet emancipation, a final act of her son's pragmatic mercy. She was allowed to live out her remaining days in a manor house, a comfortable exile. The scent of the sea, carried on the salty winds, would sometimes reach her, a reminder of her journey across the Channel, the beginning of her epic saga. She died in 1303 and beyond, a queen who had tasted the pinnacle of power, who had dared to challenge the established order, and who had ultimately been consumed by the very forces she had sought to control. Her legacy was a complex tapestry woven with threads of brilliance and brutality, of love and betrayal, of ambition and downfall. She remained, and would forever remain, a figure of enduring fascination, a queen who had not only worn a crown but had dared to seize it, forever etching her name into the annals of history as Isabella, the she-wolf of France.